So what I'm going to focus on as part of this grant is how we went about using behavioral science research to actually design our low-cost behavior change intervention, getting at promotion of latrine use, specifically in the state of Odisha. Okay. So what I have here is a diagram showing our actual design process. And this process came from a variety of other process frameworks, but we kind of created our own off of that. So the first thing we did was decide what our behavior was. And this is often not kind of given the space I think it needs to pinpoint what behavior are we actually talking about. So I'll be saying the phrase latrine use over the next several minutes, but what I really mean by latrine use is the specific behavior of having people exclusively use their government-provided household latrine for defecation. And for people who are not physically able to use their household latrine, maybe small children, maybe ill or very elderly members of the family, to safely dispose of their feces into the latrine. And when we talk about latrine use behavior, we're often also talking about the behavior of open defecation. So we're promoting one behavior and trying to end the practice of another behavior. So those are the target behaviors that we're talking about specifically. And what we did to design our intervention was go through 4 different phases to continuously try and identify the behavioral factors at play for these behaviors. So what are the barriers and motivators for people in performing these behaviors? So the first thing we did was conduct a literature review to say, you know, what do we know to date so far? There's a lot that's been done. Let's map that out and see what we know so far and identify gaps. And then we also explored different behavior change theories that we would want to use to help guide our design process. And I'm actually going to talk a little bit about that right now. So a lot of times when people are designing behavior change interventions, in some cases it seems that one behavior change theory is used. But our team found that we actually wanted to weave together several theories so that we could really fully explore these behaviors. So the overarching behavior change theory that we used to guide us was behavior-centered design by Bob Unger and Val Curtis at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And their theory is that, which echoes a lot of what we've heard today, is that behaviors happen in a behavioral setting, which is indicated by this dashed line box, where if you change the environment in that behavioral setting, create a surprise to the environment, it causes the brain to change because it has to reevaluate what's going on here. And then this can lead to a change in behavior performance. And kind of like what we've talked about already, environment, we're really talking about both the physical environment. So if we think about latrine use, we're talking about the structure of a household latrine, open defecation sites, these kind of physical environment aspects, and also the social environment. So what are the social expectations around the practice of using a latrine or the practice of open defecation? So this social environment component our team felt was really important to explore more deeply based on our own formative research and our literature review. So we pulled in Christina Bicchieri's social norm theory to make sure that we honed in on, how are we defining a social norm? If we want latrine use to become a social norm, how do you go about creating a new norm? And so that's how we wove that theory in. And similarly, we wove in Hans Mosler's RANAS model to help us dig deeper into the brain component. So that model helps you think about things like risk factors, attitude factors, ability, and explore the brain component. So these were the 3 behavior change theories that guided our work. So what we did next was we conducted formative research. This was a specific phase of the grant that was funded. We conducted formative research where we held a series of in-depth interviews with different kinds of behavior practitioners. So we talked to individuals who were using their government latrine. We talked to individuals who were not using their government latrine but had one. We talked to people who had used their latrine so much, or their household had used it so much that they'd already emptied the pit of that latrine. And we also talked to mothers who were practicing safe disposal of child feces. So there weren't many mothers who were doing this. We were specifically working in Puri district in Odisha, but there were some. And we interviewed them, as well as conducted focus group discussions with mothers who had never heard about the safe disposal of child feces in that practice. So we conducted this formative research and again used our 3 behavioral change theories to help guide not only the questions that we asked in those interviews, but then to analyze the findings from that formative work. The next phase was actually applying that evidence. And our team always calls this the black box of intervention design because we often learn about the behavioral factors at play for behavior or the formative research that a group has done, and then automatically there's this behavior change intervention that they've come up with. But we don't hear that much about, well, how did you go from this finding to this specific intervention activity? So the process that we took was kind of 2 major steps, and this kind of speaks to kind of the art of behavior change design. But we used problem trees to help us organize our findings around the barriers to behavior. So problem trees help you identify, okay, what are the key barriers to this behavior, the root barriers, and what are the underlying causes of those. So it gives you a structural image of your findings. And then we mapped types of behavioral factors onto those trees. So we would say, this chunk or limb of the tree is really getting at the social environment, this chunk's really getting at attitudes, and mapped our behavioral factors on there. Then we used a design matrix to start brainstorming intervention activities where we would say, okay, here's the barrier from our problem tree, here's the type of behavioral factor that we categorized it as, here are behavior change techniques that get at that factor. So if the factor is attitudes, what kind of behavior change techniques change attitudes? And then we brainstormed as a team, the art side, the craft side to this, what intervention activities we would do to utilize that behavior change technique. So our last step was then to do something called what we were calling behavioral trials, where we did mini pilots of different intervention activities to see how they worked. And I want to point out that 2 major things is that, as you can see throughout this process, behavioral science research was there every step of the way. We started out identifying behavior change theories. We wanted to guide us and use them throughout. And we also engaged participants throughout, the people whose behavior we were trying to change. We did formative research, conducting interviews. We actually constructed problem trees in villages where we were doing those interviews to see how people would order the barriers themselves compared to how our research team had done it. Were we aligning in our thinking? And then the behavioral trials, of course, was a lot of eliciting feedback and kind of doing mini debriefs with participants who had been a part of those activities to say, hey, did that work for you? What did you get out of that? So now I'll dive into a quick snapshot of our actual intervention that we came up with. So this is the theory of change for our intervention. So we have our intervention activities on the left. We have that behavior-centered design theory in the middle, where we have what components of the physical and social environment are we trying to change, what part of the brain state are we trying to change, and then, of course, our behavioral outcome. And our intervention is called Sundaragrama, which in Oriya means beautiful village, and that's because it's a shortened version of our intervention motto, which is my clean, healthy, beautiful village. And so you can see that our intervention activities had 3 levels. We had activities at the community level, the group level, and the household level. And I'm just going to go through an example from each level and show how it plays out in this theory of change. So one activity that we have that is actually kind of like the opening activity to our intervention is a pala performance. So this is a traditional folk art performance in Odisha, where skits and drama and music are used to convey stories. And so we use the pala performance to convey sanitation stories. But unlike kind of the more typical messaging we get in behavior change interventions, these stories aren't just health messages, right? They're really tapping into a variety of motives that we wanted to get into. They're tapping into issues around abilities, so knowing how to use a latrine, for mothers knowing how to safely dispose of your child's feces, using a skit to act that out and give that visually to participants. And yeah, just going into a variety of different messaging. So for instance, we have a skit where to get at status and aspiration of a latrine and the pride that it can give you, we have a story of the goddess Lakshmi coming to passing up someone's household because they don't use their latrine and their house seems, disgusting, and she goes to another household who is using their latrine, who has a very nice, beautiful home. So that's the example of the Paula performance. It's utilizing that edutainment kind of behavior change technique. At the group level, we have mother groups meetings. So this is really focused on the specific behavior of safe disposal of child feces and examining what are the different methods for safe disposal at different ages for your child, from infant to toddler, right before they might learn how to use a latrine. And what we found from our formative work was this is just a behavior that's really not even known. It's just so not in people's awareness. So a lot of what this activity does is a lot of skill building and action knowledge. So yeah, there's health messaging, but really it's about demonstrating the different practices that we're hoping mothers will perform, providing them that physical environment by giving them hardware like scoops and potties that they can use to aid in safe disposal. And yes, just doing this kind of demonstration work to get at mostly the ability factor. And then lastly, at the household level, we have a household visit. And I should say that all these activities are implemented by community mobilizers. So community mobilizer comes to a household and kind of does a one-on-one, almost like a counseling visit for households on their specific barriers that they're facing to their latrine use. So this is getting more personal. And it's focusing a lot on that self-regulation component where they're talking to household members on, what are the barriers you're facing to your latrine use? How can we create action plans to overcome those and really make a commitment to performing this behavior? So this is the overall theory of change. And I think the last bit that I was supposed to speak to is how we've engaged policymakers in getting buy-in for our intervention. And I think that's something that our team has struggled in, trying to figure that out. But two things that we have done is really trying to keep scalability in mind so that this is an intervention that seems feasible to government stakeholders. And also, in the next coming weeks, we just finished our baseline data collection for the randomized controlled trial to evaluate this intervention, and now we're moving into training the implementing partner, this cohort of community mobilizers on the activities, and so we hope to invite water and sanitation department heads to see these activities in action and hopefully generate buy-in that way. So, thank you.